So our last snippet for this week looks at the collapse of this 1920 system. Whether you want to call it Wilsonian or something else, the U.S. is quite active in Europe and in East Asia, trying to prop up the international order. Much less active in Nicaragua and Haiti and Mexico, where it's kind of using the threat of military intervention to get what it's want, but as a result, generating a lot of domestic political blowback. And then in 1929, we get the stock market crash, a bunch of other things occurring in terms of the international economy, and the beginning of the Great Depression. And this chart gives a sense of how the Depression, has this incredible effect, not just domestically in terms of U.S. job losses, but internationally. So, if you look at the changes in economic production in late 20s, early 30s after the Depression, U.S. industrial production drops by around a half. Germany's is close to a half as well. Britain's is a quarter. And in terms of foreign trade, all of them have a reduction of greater than 50%. So basically, the world economy contracts, and all major countries kind of say, all right, we're going to look out for our own rather than cooperate internationally. And the result of these kind of trade wars and the economy everywhere goes down. This is particularly problematic for Germany, which was so heavily reliant on foreign economic assistance, foreign trade, and the country essentially collapses. The government collapses in the late 20s and early 30s. The centrist parties continue to get smaller and smaller. The communists gain in strength, but the key party that's gaining here are the Nazis, and these are Nazi campaign posters. And this one on the left, I think, is particularly interesting. So you see the Nazi, the Air Force plane here dropping not bombs but swastikas on Germany, and the argument here is that elect Hitler and he'll reestablish the German military. He'll ensure that no one goes hungry. He'll create jobs. This is a kind of popular rhetoric, and by 1932, in the parliamentary elections of Germany, there's the creation of what's called a negative majority. That is, the majority of the German Reichstag is committed to the destruction of the democratic state, whether it's the 38% or so that vote for the Nazis, or the 14.5% that vote for the communists. Now, the Nazis and communists hate each other, and they're fighting in the street. These parties have paramilitaries, but nonetheless, they're equally committed to the destruction of German democracy as a whole. And remember, this Democratic Party that I mentioned in the previous snippet was kind of sort of the party that showed the health of the democracy under Weimar. By 1932, that party has dropped to just 1% of the vote, from 18% in 1919. So their support just sort of implodes. In 1933, Hitler undertakes a series of moves to establish complete control over the German government. This is him addressing the German Reichstag, urging passage of a measure called the Enabling Act, under which the Reichstag transfers its authority to Hitler. This comes very shortly after he comes to power in 1933, and the result is the creation of a totalitarian dictatorship, which is, we all know Hitler's domestic agenda. For our purposes, the critical aspect, though, is the foreign agenda, which calls for rebuilding up the German military and reclaiming all territory throughout Europe populated by Germans. So Hitler has this racialist view of the world, that all German citizens should be under the control of the German state, and if they're not, that the German government should invade foreign countries to acquire this territory. It's not just Hitler who's really challenging the international order. It's also the Japanese. In 1931, they invade the Chinese province of Manchuria. China, remember, is a member of the League of Nations. They appeal to the League of Nations assistance. Article 10 of the League of Nations Covenant, that was the Woodrow Wilson proposal to create collective security. So here we have a Japanese attack on Manchuria. China appeals for League assistance. Certainly all of the members of the League will come to China's assistance and fight against the Japanese. we know how this story ends as well. It's the middle of the Depression. None of these European countries are willing to come to the aid of the Chinese, and the result is a Japanese conquest of Manchuria and the creation of a puppet state, Manchukuo, which will be under Japanese control until 1945. This is a photograph of the Japanese tanks moving into Manchuria. It was a planned operation. The Japanese contend that they were only intervening to prevent Chinese sabotage against Japanese railroad possessions in the province. I mean, no one believed that. The League of Nations was designed to deal with this. Article 10, collective security. Instead, no one does anything to protect the Chinese. In the middle of the Depression, no government is willing to spend the money that will be necessary to get troops over to Manchuria, and the result is a 6-month delayed League of Nations report, which says that this is military intervention. It's not supposed to be allowed under the League of Nations protocols. Japan refuses to accept the report and withdraws from the League of Nations, and nothing else, more or less, is happening. So it's an illustration of the weakness of the League. In the U.S., by this point, the Depression has had sort of terrible consequences, and FDR sweeps the country. This is a map of the 1932 presidential election. The Democratic performance here is in green. The Republican performance is in red. Roosevelt wins throughout the South, throughout the Midwest, throughout the West, and even does reasonably well in the Northeast, which traditionally had been a Republican bastion in national politics. Roosevelt comes in, his primary focus, his overwhelming focus is domestic affairs. Well, one thing that I should note about this photo, Roosevelt contracted polio in the 1920s, which left him unable to walk. There was this impression, which may well be accurate for America during the 1920s, that the country would never elect a disabled man. And so Roosevelt goes to great lengths to conceal his disability. So here he is standing as he accepts the oath of office. Now, you don't really see his hands here. When he would stand, either he'd be helped up by his sons, or he'd have very powerful braces to keep him standing up. But the image that he projects to the country is this is a man who's on top of his game. He's going to stand and bring a new order. Initially, Roosevelt's biggest change in U.S. foreign policy comes in the Western Hemisphere. He promotes adoption of the Montevideo Accords. This is a photograph of the U.S. Diplomatic delegation in Montevideo. This is a meeting. These meetings occurred every 5 years of all of the countries in the Western Hemisphere to try to flesh out opportunities for cultural exchange, for economic cooperation, and also for political non-intervention. And the U.S. tended to be the opponent of this. In 1933, Roosevelt agrees to the idea of non-intervention in the Western Hemisphere. He also tells the Cubans that the U.S. doesn't really want the Platt Amendment anymore, and recommends to the Cubans that they should withdraw the Platt Amendment from their constitution. The Cubans do so. It looks like there'll be a kind of restrained role, but there are some in the Roosevelt administration who want activism, but activism on the left. The most important of these figures is this man, Ernest Greening, who will later be governor and senator from Alaska. And Greening, in the Roosevelt years, is head of an organization called the Division of Territory and Island Possessions, DTIP, and also is head of the Puerto Rican Reconstruction Authority, the PRRA. He's sort of the U.S. chief colonial officer. And Greening pushes the idea of a kind of left-wing anti-imperialist experiment. The U.S. providing money to the Puerto Ricans and to the Haitians as a way of creating a more just society. Greening is not the most effective administrator in the world. He struggles in Caribbean matters. Roosevelt basically tires of him in the end. Roosevelt didn't like to fire people. So he tells Greening, look, I have this great job for you, governor of Alaska. You can take it, and if you don't take it, you're not going to have a job at all. Greening decides to take it, but so he's a reminder with Roosevelt and Latin American affairs. The idea is non-intervention on political matters, but perhaps economic or other kinds of cooperation to create more egalitarian societies throughout the Western Hemisphere. The other big domestic policy, or domestic action regarding foreign policy during the Roosevelt administration is the creation of this thing called the Nye Committee. This man that I'm circling here is Gerald Nye, who's a Republican senator from North Dakota, a peace progressive. It's one of these left-wing Republicans. And in the middle of the Depression, Nye says that he wants to look into the origins of U.S. intervention in World War I. And the Democrats not only agree with Nye's suggestion, but they allowed Nye, even though he's a Republican, to serve as chair of the committee. And this committee undertakes an investigation which lasts around 18 months. Unsurprisingly, it concludes the U.S. intervention in World War I was improper. This is, Nye had believed this at the time. And it calls for restrictions on U.S. Sort of military aid to other countries, and also pushes the idea of neutrality, which comes to be codified in the 1935 Neutrality Act, which says that when there are countries fighting one another, the president must immediately declare neutrality, and the U.S. can't be involved either way. This is the perfect plan to keep the United States out of World War I. The U.S. entered World War I 18 years before. But the Nye Committee has a really important effect in that it confirms, Nye is very popular. It confirms that the Nye approach is shared by lots and lots of Americans. Now, so under FDR and foreign policy with the good neighbor policy, non-intervention in the Western Hemisphere, and then we have Roosevelt agreeing to go along with the Nye Committee recommendations and this new act, this Neutrality Act, but he's not particularly happy about it, and he does get it modified in significant ways. And then we have events in Ethiopia in 1936 when Mussolini decides to invade. Ethiopia, if you looked at the list of League of Nations states that I sent around a couple of weeks ago, Ethiopia is a founding member of the League. So by 1936, they have been in the League for 17 years. And yet when the Italians under Mussolini invade them from the Italian colonies of Italian Somaliland and Eritrea, the League once again, as in Manchuria, does nothing. So what Manchuria shows and what Ethiopia shows is that Article 10, Wilson's collective security provision, which said that an attack on one member of the League is basically an attack on all, that this is a dead letter, that these countries are going to stand aside, including the United States, and allow countries like Ethiopia, which is deemed not particularly important strategically, to be overrun. So things are getting kind of dark by 1935, 1936. We have Manchuria, we have the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. The depression seems to be getting worse. And next week in the snippets, we'll be looking at the run up to World War II and then how this all plays out in the conflict. Be well.